This podcast is a production of Queens Public Television in New York City. Visit us on the web at qptv.org.
Hey, I'm Mark Bassino, and this is Queens Creative. Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening, and welcome to another episode of the Queens Creative Podcast, coming to you from Queens Public Television in New York City. On today's pod, I welcome Queens Poet Laureate Maria Lisella. Awarded the Poet Laureate position in 2015 by then Borough President Melinda Katz, Queens native and current Astoria resident Ms. Lisella is the sixth poet to hold the borough's esteemed laureate title. In 2020, Maria was also named a Poet Laureate Fellow by the Academy of American Poets, and to date has 3 books of poetry to her credit as an author. In addition to her work as a poet, Ms. Lisella has also taught at college level and holds a master's degree from NYU-Polytechnic Institute. And if all those accomplishments weren't enough, the talented Ms. Lisella is also a skilled journalist, currently New York culture editor for the Jerusalem Post, and an award-winning travel writer, with a 30-year career that has taken her to over 60 countries and seen her work published by such outlets as USA Today and Travel and Leisure. Listen in on this episode as Maria and I discuss Maria's Queens roots, her love of poetry, the creative process, her work as a travel writer, and much more. Then, after our talk, be sure and stick around as Maria treats us to a special reading of 2 original poems. Okay, let's jump right over to my interesting conversation with Queens Poet Laureate and journalist Maria Lisella. Hi, Maria. Welcome to Queens Creative. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me.
Oh, it was my pleasure. You know, I thought we'd start things off by discussing your very cool Queens Poet Laureate title, right? For our listeners who might not be familiar, could you talk a little about the laureate position and what it is and the official responsibilities that come with the title?
So the Queens Poet Laureate started, now I'm going to forget the year, but in any case, it was under Borough President Claire Schulman. There were a lot of actual cultural initiatives that were started under her administration, including the Museum of the Moving Image, by the way.
Really?
Yeah. And Queens College played a big role in developing this position. I was sworn in under Borough President Melinda Katz, whose own family, by the way, was a very big cultural mavens. I think one started the Philharmonic and one helped to start the Queens Culture for the Arts or something. Mm-hmm. And she was very supportive. So essentially it's a competitive position, competitive situation. You submit 10 pages of your poems, a panel of experts that will review the work. They choose a few candidates and they'll be interviewed and read their work out loud. Oh. So that panel is usually made up of cultural institutions or representatives from cultural institutions, libraries, universities, could be a couple of writers, museum, what else? Queens Council on the Arts, St. John's, maybe would have the Art College and so on. Anyway, so those people interview you. Essentially the job, which is non-paying, simply demands that you initiate at least 3 programs within each year. And it's a 3-year, it's usually a 3-year position. The person before me, Paulo Javier, had it for 4 years. I'm moving into my 6th year.
6th year, yeah.
And, this is also pandemic. I should have actually been done with it in 2018. It was 2015 to 2018. But I did actually an enormous amount of events. My predecessor, Paulo Javier, who's really a wonderful experimental poet, and he was also the director of programming at Poets House, and is a good friend. Mm-hmm. He initiated a giant event at Queens Museum. It was like an all-day reading with like 100 poets or something.
That's cool.
I actually chose to do something quite the opposite, which were smaller, more intimate events, but a lot more of them. And when I was sworn in, the Queens libraries had partnered with the position, and they had not always been partners. So that became my platform to reach the public without having to reinvent the wheel. From there, I've done workshops. Now I've done workshops also. But at that time, it was mostly readings, open mics, small workshops, summer poetry contests that encouraged people from third grade to adults to submit their work. And then that would culminate into a public reading, usually at Flushing Library.
Oh, cool.
Which had very nice, very nice audience, very nice auditorium. So the idea of the people who are choosing the Poet Laureate, to have people represent some of the cultural institutions, that's essential. And that's what didn't happen in the interim. And the entire process got a little bit off kilter because Melinda Katz had left. She went to become DA. There was a little hiatus. So that's why I continued with the title. But the people who are involved with the administration of the Queens Poet Laureate become essentially the contacts for the Poet Laureate to reach out to and say, I'd like to do a program at your place, at your venue, whatever. And so that's why those people should be provided in the process. So the process has to be a little bit streamlined, and I'm hoping to have that conversation with Donovan Richards at some point. Further, last year, I won a national fellowship from the Academy of American Poets, and that was a national position, and it was available only to Poets Laureate. Oh. So I was very lucky that my title, got extended.
I see, yeah.
The other thing that happened in 2017-18 was my husband got very sick, and he died in 2018. So even though my title was officially supposed to be over, it looked like the Borough President office was going to allow me to extend it anyway, because of his death. And I was essentially non-functioning for a while. So, but I think that was kind of understandable. But
sure.
The Queens Poet Laureate Fellowship with the American Academy of Poets, however, also offered me a new opportunity. And so I developed a series of workshops, and I did them at museums such as Noguchi Museum, the Greater Astoria Historical Association, various Queens libraries, Sage, and a few other places. Mm-hmm. That was really gratifying because workshopping wasn't something that I knew cold. It was kind of a new skill for me. And I really embraced it, and I really loved it. And the most gratifying thing that came out of it is that within all the series of workshops I held, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, and that went on and on, 14 individuals decided they wanted to stay together. And they formed something called Thursday Morning Poets.
Right, I've seen your involvement in that, yeah.
Yeah, and that group performed at the New York City Poetry Festival on Governor's Island. And that group will continue. So that's a little bit long story on the Queens Poet Laureate. Queens Poet Laureate, you don't get paid. You're supposed to do at least 3 events a year. And I've done many more than that. But it's been a pleasure, and I've met so many really wonderful people in this process.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of offshoots that have come out of your experience with it.
Yeah.
That's cool. It
was. And, the timing was kind of funny because while I had that hiatus when my husband was sick, it also became a lifesaver,
sure.
Because it forced me to be involved at a time when I kind of wanted to hibernate, which is not really the healthiest thing to do.
No, right.
So, and he was also a poet.
Right, I saw, yeah.
Yeah, coincidentally, when I applied for the Poet Laureate, it was the second time I applied. The first time I was a runner-up, and I didn't get it, and Julio Marzan got the title. Then Paulo Javier got the next title.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was pretty excited to apply. And my husband, in fact, was thinking of applying. And he said, well, you're really the Queens resident, so I'll wait another time and you go ahead and do it. So I did. And so I was really, really excited about it.
That's great.
And Melinda Katz was great, very supportive. She showed up in a million places that she wouldn't normally have showed up in.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a great experience. And Jennifer Weprin was also very key to making that position successful.
That's great. That's great.
Anyway.
I mean, it's
you'll have to edit me out.
No. I'm very, curious. I'm very curious about it. And I think a lot of people don't know about, the fact that Queens has a poet laureate. So it's good to get some background on it.
What's different about it is that the one in Brooklyn is appointed.
Oh, I see.
The one in Queens is competitive.
Right.
So
cool. Interesting. Well, I wanted to rewind things a little bit and talk to you about your background.
Sure.
You're a native New Yorker with some deep Queens roots. You were born in South Jamaica. You were raised in Belrose. You lived in Flushing as a student before you settled in Astoria, where you live now, and you've lived for many years. Can you describe what it is about this borough that obviously means so much to you, having, lived so much of your life here?
Yeah, it's kind of a funny question because you could say, well, because I was born here, I stayed here. But there was a period in my life when Manhattan really was a lure, especially Greenwich Village, which is where my mother was born, on Carmine Street.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I lived a lot of my life in Manhattan, whether it was a job or it was taking dance classes or... So there was a lot of that. But I took my first trip to Europe when I was, I think, 19. I went to Italy. The second trip I took maybe when I was about 23. And when I came back with a boyfriend who was not from Queens, but he was originally from Queens. He was from Astoria. And we decided to move in together, and we decided to look in Astoria first. And I realized it was like kind of the most European corner of the city for me. And it was only affordable, and it was a place that I could understand.
Okay.
So we moved into this great neighborhood, and, chock full of very small stores. There was a store at one point that sold butter and eggs, and that's all he sold. As soon as he was done with selling the butter and eggs, it was closed.
Close the store, right?
Yeah,
that's it.
And because the rents at that time were, ridiculously cheap. So Astoria became for me kind of a little bit of an extension of Europe. It's now much more multicultural, has more Latins in it, has Asians in it. It's a lot more interesting than it might have been before. But that was the old Astoria, and it was already kind of a gateway for people coming in from another place. There's little pockets of Irish also, which overlaps, I guess, with Sunnyside and Woodside. But it's kind of constantly changing, like everything else is. But this, you see the changes in your supermarket. You walk into the supermarket, and all of a sudden, there's a big display of Brazilian products, and you go, oh, Brazilians live here now. Oh,
right.
I wonder who they are. And it goes on like that. And
ever-changing Queens.
Yeah, and the supermarkets alone can be like small cultural experiences. This is particular to Astoria, but it's also true in Richmond Hill, which has changed over the years from, Italian to Guyanese and Pakistani and Indian and Bengali. So, it's, I find Queens just the most fluid of all the boroughs.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's
so diverse, and that's what makes it amazing.
We apparently have 139 languages that are spoken in Queens.
Yeah,
pretty amazing.
What was it like for you growing up in Queens? Like, what was that experience for you as a kid?
In Jamaica, I lived on 116th Drive, right near what was Paisley Park. I think it's called something else now. And my aunt lived down the block. My aunt and my cousins. So for me, it was kind of a little bit of a village. But the time that I was growing up, it was mostly African American.
Mm-hmm.
There were very few white families within a few blocks of each other. But that community was they were so aligned with each other because economically we were all about the same. And the idea of family with African American families, okay, this was the 50s and 60s, so it was coloreds, it was Negroes, you didn't say black, but you know, the idea was that they were families like ours. And so there was a lot of commonality rather than disparate economic classes.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned very early that it's economics that is actually more key than the color of your skin or the country you come from. And it's economics and class, education, social class. And class really, I hate to use the word, but trumps, color, trumps race. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of a very important lesson. When we moved to Belrose, that was a very white neighborhood, and that was kind of a shocking experience, actually.
Very different than what you were used to.
Yeah, it was shocking because we were the dark people, and that neighborhood wasn't that friendly initially. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of an odd move. But anyway, my mother still lives there, and now her neighborhood is Indian.
Yeah, again.
So it's like totally Indian.
Ever-changing
and we
Queens.
made it actually more interesting because it wasn't that interesting.
Right.
But,
right.
So
my next question has to be this. How does a kid from Queens find her way to poetry? I mean, when I was growing up in Queens, kids were, out playing stickball and basketball in the schoolyard. I wasn't running into too many poets. I mean, it's kind of unique. How did you come to your love of poetry?
Well, I lived in a household of a couple of languages. My grandparents lived with us. It was a 3-generation household. My grandparents spoke Italian dialect. My mother could speak Italian and dialect and English, of course. And learning the language orally, which is how I learned Italian or dialect first, was a game. So words were a game. But I also went to Catholic school. And Catholic school,
me too.
The nuns were incredibly literate. Mm-hmm. They were the most literate women I'd met, and the most educated women I knew. Because not everybody went to college in my family. So they particularly emphasized grammar, writing, composition. The word was really, really important. And of course, the message was also religious, but that really wasn't only the message. It was about communication. It was about phonics. It was about hearing the sound. It was about talking out loud. It was about listening. And I think nuns really provided an incredible patchwork of information about the word, because that's just what their orientation was.
Right.
And so I think I realized that my first poem was a haiku when I was about 16, and it was in Dominican Commercial High School's newsletter. Mm-hmm. And I guess that really was like my first public, published poem.
Wow. That's cool. So it was the nuns that I think the
nuns, yeah,
the nuns influenced you.
Yeah, because they created a love of poetry. They read poetry. They emphasized it. Yeah, they had a lot of rules.
Sure.
But you didn't leave even a grammar school without knowing how to write a composition.
That's true. That's true. I'm a Catholic school survivor myself, so I can attest to that. It's true.
But I was also by the time I got to high school, it was Vatican II. Mm-hmm. Vatican II was an enormously radical event in the Catholic Church. That was when Pope John XXIII was in the Vatican. And, that began the whole modification of nuns' habits were getting shorter.
Modernization of things.
There was English spoken at Mass rather than Latin.
Right.
The priest no longer had his back to you. He faced the parishioners during Mass. So, and it was also the time of Vietnam.
Right.
It was the time of civil rights. it was a great time in that sense that it was a stimulating time.
Sort of a renaissance, sort of, yeah.
Yeah, and you had singers who were poets.
Right.
The music was poetic.
Mm-hmm. Very true.
You sort of had it everywhere, whether it was, Love Story and Rod McEwen, whether you like him or not, and, Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and, Judy Collins, all these people were singing poetry, and some of it was protest poetry. So it blended politics and poetry.
Yeah, it was an amazing time for sure. It's sometimes it's a shame that we don't have a similar thing going these days. I mean, you see little glimpses of it, but you have to search it out, I think, more than you used to. That's for sure. Now, I wanted to fast forward a bit to the present. You currently have 3 published books of poetry to your credit as an author. Thieves in the Family, Amore on Hope Street, and Two Naked Feet. I was hoping, can you tell us a little about each of these collections that you have?
Yeah. Two Naked Feet was actually my first foray into creating a collection in a little chapbook form. And it was really Roxanne Hoffman, who runs Poets Wear Prada, who really encouraged me. Mm-hmm. And she said, why aren't I publishing you? I said, I
don't know. It's a good question.
So that was it was like, wow, good idea. So that was first. And then after that, Finishing Line Press provided the platform for a larger chapbook.
Okay.
And that was Amore on Hope Street. And that chapbook, I'm very proud of. It's really a very pretty chapbook. Well, I'll show you because you're here.
Yes, it's a great cover.
I found this Matryoshka doll who has the words desiderio in Italian, love in English, drama, and courage. And it was Italian and English, and I found it online. And Amore on Hope Street is actually a restaurant in Stamford, Connecticut.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And I used to go there with my mother-in-law, who also passed away. But she really loved that restaurant. So she was kind of an inspiration for that one.
It's a great title.
Yeah, I really put my heart and soul into that. And Finishing Line Press produces such great, beautiful looking chapbooks. And I think at that time, the editor was Leah Maines, mm-hmm. and she's still with them. And it taught me how to market my book because they give you an outline of how to do it. It was really an educational experience. And then the third book, again, I have to thank Raymond Hammond for liking my work. He heard me read one night, asked me to send my work in. And I put together this book, this collection, which includes, there's like a little section on immigration. There's a section on family. There's a section on love. Mm-hmm. And I did that. And I learned that when you put a book together, in some ways it's a little bit of a team effort because chances are you're going to have someone help you read it. My husband read everything, of course. Then I had my friend Rosalind help mm-hmm. me. My friend Canada helped me. People who had done this before. And it's like a wonderful experience. The next book I've written, which isn't published yet, is called The Man with the Plan.
Oh.
The Man
so
with
you finished it, or is it's still in the works?
Finished it, and I'm peddling it around trying to get it published.
I got you.
It's a chapbook, but
mm-hmm.
it's an unusual one. It mainly took its inspiration from my stepson, Mario. I was a stepmother, mm-hmm. Still am, and Mario is 43, so I met Mario 40 years ago, and he does have a mental illness. He's also very creative. And so in the book, I have one of his poems, and I have 3 from my husband, mm-hmm. who didn't write that much about his kids initially because they both have a mental illness, and we always preserve their privacy. Mm-hmm. But with my husband's death, I felt like, part of my voice is being a stepmother.
Right.
And I think it doesn't hurt to share the experience of having mentally ill children in your family mm-hmm. and how you deal with that. And so that's why I put Mario's poem in the book also.
Oh, that's great.
So I'm hoping that gets published pretty soon. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, well, it's always tough. I know as a musician, it's always it's tough to get your stuff out there, but you got to be persistent, and eventually it happens. You've got a good track record. So, sort of in keeping with the theme of your work and your books, I've noticed, your Italian American background is sort of a prominent presence in your work. How important a role has that culture and those roots played in your development as a poet? I was curious about that.
Yeah, I can't underestimate that because, okay, so I met my husband, over 40 years ago, but we didn't date for a long time. And we were both, he's also Italian American.
Mm-hmm.
We were both stymied in certain ways about our politics was progressive, both of us. What drove us crazy was the image of Italian Americans in the media.
Right.
Drove us crazy because we knew there was more to the story than having the most right-wing people.
That's right. It's very frustrating sometimes. Yep.
Yeah. And so what we did was together we kind of created a curriculum of Italian American readings.
Mm-hmm.
And that included Mario Puzo's Fortunate Pilgrim, which a lot of people don't know about, but it's about an Italian family who moves to America
mm-hmm.
and what happens to them, right? It's the immigrant story, but it's not The Godfather.
Right.
Okay. And there were others. And then we also sort of delved into the politics and learned about other people like, Angela Bombace, who was a famous, not so famous in the Italian community, but a union leader
mm-hmm.
Who risked so much to be able to do what she did. And Vito Marcantonio, Fiorello LaGuardia,
mm-hmm.
Leonard Covello. And these people we sort of exhumed, right?
Mm-hmm.
But having done that, we also bumped into what was called the Italian American Writers Association,
okay.
who had been running monthly readings from 1991.
Mm-hmm.
And they're still running. So it's, we're running a long time, 30 years. And that group gave voice to people like Maria Mazziotti Gillen. And listening to these voices at Cornelia Street Cafe or Barnes & Noble's Astor Place, wherever they were located, gave us the idea that, there is another experience, Italian-American experience. It's not all the same.
Right.
Everyone has different ones. There are certain commonalities. And Iowa kind of drew mostly progressive Italian-Americans to it.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it was the Yusef Hawkins murder is what partly inspired the formation of this group.
Okay.
Because again, the only Italian Americans that were viewed were the ones, raising, watermelons over their heads and Bensonhurst. And, it was
right.
very skewed. And we realized also that in the established publishing world, Italian Americans didn't always get their books reviewed quite as often as other groups.
Really interesting. Wow.
And there were a lot of little funny things like that. And so Iowa provided kind of an educational platform for both of us.
Mm-hmm.
My husband wrote 8 books of poetry, actually,
wow.
Before he died. And he really only learned Italian at the age of 50. So we felt like it was also part of our experience not to be ashamed of who we were.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah.
And so we kind of developed these different routes. So our interest in Vito Marcantonio was also based on the fact that my husband lived and worked in East Harlem for a period of time. So he was very familiar with that area, which had been the largest Italian-American neighborhood in the country at one point. And that led later to the formation of the Vito Marcantonio Forum,
okay.
which continues now. It's an educational organization And it's always linked, our events are always linked with cultural events.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess it's a little bit based on Antonio Gramsci's, mission or, belief that it's through culture that you change minds.
Right.
And so this is like, it's really, so the Italian-American identity became very essential to me because I felt like I had to face it. But I don't describe myself as an Italian-American author.
Right. It's a part of who you are, but it's not doesn't define you per se.
Right. You don't want that to happen, but it does happen. And in publishing, to be a hyphenated American, is not always where you want to be.
Right.
So I did go out of my way to get my work published by non-Italian press at the time. Mm-hmm. I mean, as it is now, presses like Wernicke in Canada and Bordighera Press really have a lot more prestige than they did initially, mm-hmm. Because there's sort of a big open space for us. But and you don't have to write about your grandmother anymore, because you want to get that.
Right.
But it really helped develop a lot of writers' voices. And we've seen that over a period of 30 years, people developing a lot more books. Their voices have gotten more sophisticated and kind of more interesting. Mm-hmm. So I think essentially when you have an ethnic background, it's really essential that you look at it, you see what it's worth, you see what it can give you, and you write first, of course, on about the things you know.
Right.
And then work out from there. Hopefully people work beyond their own little, ethnic mm-hmm. community to understand that it's what we have in common is what keeps us human, as opposed to just one or another. And I think that's something that we're sort of having to think about now more than ever.
For sure. And I like what you said about you don't have to write about grandmothers anymore, sort of those stereotypical Italian-American things. And it sounds like, you and your husband were able to sort of expand that, point people in a different direction, but still, retaining sort of the Italian-American roots, which is very cool.
Yeah. I think what happens is when you're a writer, you will always look through that lens mm-hmm. or that filter. Everything that comes through you comes through that filter. But it really doesn't mean you have to stamp, like you said, have your grandmother's sauce
right.
recipe.
Right, exactly.
But you might start that way.
Exactly. Now, I wanted to ask you also, being that this is Queens Creative and all, I'd be negligent if I didn't ask you about your creative process as a working poet. I was curious, do you make it a point to sit down and write something every day? Do you just write when the mood or inspiration strikes? How does that work for you? I'm
a lot messier than my husband was in this area. In fact, I always used to say, I wish I was more like you, which I still wish I was, because he was incredibly disciplined. He wrote like all the time. I mean, he would take his notebook and whatever weird detail he would gather would probably land in some sort of poem later on. I am not as driven to do that. Mm-hmm. But when I do, I have a funny process, I think. I do a lot of thinking about what I'm going to do. Mm-hmm. Or I scribble things into my phone. But what really helps me is having groups like Madison Poets, which is a group that I meet with on Thursday nights. And we've been meeting for, 10 or 15 years. And I learned about this group through Diana Festa, who passed away in 2011. I'm involved in an online poetry circle called Brevitas. I'm involved with the Thursday Morning Poets. Mm-hmm. So I kind of have deadlines. Because I'm a journalist, I kind of need deadlines. Brevitas is a group that we write twice a month on the 15th and the 1st, a poem of 14 lines or less. Mm-hmm. We circulate it just through email. We might be about 55, 60 poets now, and we've been doing it for 17 years.
Wow. So it's like appointment writing almost too. It's
right.
It's funny. I've heard that about other people and other pursuits, songwriting, like belonging to a songwriting group and know that you have to write something on this particular topic by this day. It sort of pushes you into that mindset.
And then I have to add that, my sister Julia Lisella is also a poet. And, and I was living with a guy who was, he worked as a social worker by profession, but he was really a writer and an activist. And those people really influenced me a lot. My sister is, 9 years younger than me. My husband was 7 years older than me. But we had this going. We didn't sit down necessarily and read each other's work all the time. My husband and I did. We had a folder in the dining room that was called Scambio, exchange. So we would put kind of drafts of poems in there. And when the other one would have time to look at it, we would and write comments and just keep putting them in there. And so I also had great workshop leaders. Angelo Verga, who used to run the programs at Cornelia Street Cafe, was an excellent teacher. Maria Mazziotti Gillen is an excellent teacher. The Calandra Institute has really rich programs of writers reading, but also more information about Italian American history and so on. And all of that sort of feeds into each other to build what has become a very rich community of people who really write a lot more than they did. And their work is getting published a lot more than it was, I think, 25 years ago. So
it all kind of serves as inspiration for you.
Yeah.
Now, you had mentioned, in passing about your career as a journalist, and I wanted to touch on that. So in addition to your successful career as a poet, you've had this amazing 30-year parallel career as a journalist. You're currently the New York culture editor for the Jerusalem Post and an award-winning travel writer, having visited over 60 countries. I mean, some of this stuff is incredible. You've rafted in the Jordan River, ridden horseback in the foothills of Mount Kilimanjaro, and so on. So how did you find your way from poetry to journalism and specifically travel writing?
I know. It's like the best job in the world.
It sounds like one of them for sure.
When people look at these lists and surveys, best job in the world is travel journalism. So I was always interested in journalism. I really liked writing. I started off actually in a dance company when I was younger. And then I began writing about dancers and realized that interviewing a dancer is kind of like interviewing an athlete. Their thing is moving. It's not so much, talking about moving.
Right.
So I found my way to a lot of, I thought journalism was really a glamorous thing. And, here I was a kid from Queens. I didn't really have any Seven Sister School stuff. I didn't have any links like that. So I went into business writing at first. I worked for something called Gallagher's Reports when I was first out of college. And it was like something from the 1950s, that place. But it was interesting. And that was a funny publication because it essentially relied on running to somebody who just got fired from Revlon, and they would tell you everything about what just happened at Revlon, and then you would turn that into a story. It wasn't written in a flashy way, but essentially relied on information from people who were, they were mad, right? It was great.
Disgruntled,
it was so funny.
Disgruntled workers.
Disgruntled employees who weren't shooting their bosses, but they were shooting their mouths off, which was much easier to handle. And then from there, I just kept trying to stay in publishing in some level. And I was doing fact checking at Travel and Leisure, part-time to someone who wrote for Travel and Leisure, but I was like in the background and no one knew that I was doing fact checking. At some point, I went in to present the work because I had to. And then I got a job there, fact checking. Essentially, then from there, I went to get a master's degree in specialized journalism. And I just kept with the journalism. And from Travel and Leisure, I decided to leave the Glamour magazine and go to a travel trade, which really kind of melded my business background and the idea of traveling. And it was like the best thing I ever did. It was the best move. It was like, I made like about 3 great decisions in my life. And one of them was going to Travel Agent magazine, marrying my husband, and buying my co-op. Those are my 3 big events that have totally, changed my life and made it a really rich life. And so I worked for Travel Agent magazine as international editor. And, I learned everything there. I mean, there were all these people who were older than me, older guys mostly, who would, they had that rough way of talking, drank martinis. They were like the leftovers.
Mad men.
Yeah. And they were just essentially so generous. And I was so lucky that I lived through, 3 or 4 different owners of the magazine. And you never knew if the things were going to fall off the shelf. But, went through like perestroika and glasnost and, the first tourism treaty between Jordan and Israel. I mean, the Berlin Wall falling. I mean, all of this stuff.
Right.
And it was like, wow. And here I am, just a kid from Queens, and in a way, it was the most weird job because I was really so rooted. But I think because I was so rooted, I could do a job like that because I knew I was coming home. I knew who I was.
Then you knew where you were coming back to, right?
Yeah, and I got to meet like the most interesting people in the world. I mean, from guys who ran, the Shannon Airport to like, the cultural minister of like Kenya to the head of tourism and justice in Israel. I mean, it was like phenomenal.
Wow.
And so I'm still doing it on a freelance basis. And I like writing for the Jerusalem Post. I also like writing for Never Stop Traveling because Jim Ferry's a great editor. And also he teaches me a lot and he knows how to handle your work. And, I write about delis, I write about art, so I'm still having a really good time. The only thing I'm missing is my husband. But I mean, I'm having such a great time having followed kind of my passions.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, I talk to creative people, and the one common thing in a lot of the stories that I hear is, sort of how people sort of back into things or sort of fall into these amazing things, and it sort of shapes their life in such a great way. And you imagine that you're going to hear from them and say, well, I purposely did this, and I always knew that I wanted to, and it seems to be almost the opposite. that it's like people sort of are interested in things and find their way in through like your copy editing and it just fact checking, and you have this talent, and that's.
I mean, if I had been kind of snooty, and I was like one of the older girls in fact checking, I might have turned my nose up and said fact checking.
Right?
Are you kidding? At the bottom of the ladder, but I kind of knew better that I was learning, and I learned a ton of stuff at American Express Travel and Leisure. I learned about corporate America. That was something my father couldn't teach me that in the living room.
Right.
He didn't have any connection with that. So, they were all on the job things. And my father used to tell me that when you go for a job that you don't know how to do. And even though you're supposed to look like you got the qualifications, he said, what's the point of getting a job that you already know how to do? You want a job that you're going to keep learning because it'll keep you interested in the job. And he was right, because I worked for labor unions too. And every one of them has been like a sensational learning experience.
Wow.
So
yeah, that's what you want. I mean, if you can be stimulated, that's great.
But you got to be open. You got to be open to it and not, like I said, I was modest enough to know that I didn't know that much about this or that, but I was going to learn it. And I was going to ask a lot of questions. So, I try never to come off like, oh, this is beneath me. I figured nothing's beneath me. All this stuff is like fun.
Right. Somebody
pays me to sit in front of a computer and write. Are you kidding?
Right.
That's like unbelievable.
It's an amazing gift. Yeah, for sure.
It's just an amazing ride. It's been wonderful.
It's awesome. And, I was noticing that some of your verse centers around exotic locales. For example, like a gallery in Rome in your poem Love Stuck. So do you find that there's a good amount of cross-pollination between the pursuits of the poetry and travel writing?
Yeah, you know what? The thing about travel writing, because my travel writing was business writing. Mm-hmm. It was written it was kind of advocacy writing, kind of like for travel agents. Mm-hmm. How do you sell this place? Who's the client that should come to this place? So it was factual. But as I traveled, I would be talking to a guide, for instance, and maybe I'd ask her. There was a guide in Croatia. Actually, I can read that piece. I asked her where she was during the conflict, mm-hmm. right? And she just kind of turned to me and told me her whole story. And I think people tell you stories because they think they're never going to see you again.
Right.
So they tell you like everything.
There's a certain freedom there, yeah.
Yeah, and all I had to do is ask like one question, and I got this tremendous story from her. Mm-hmm. And that a lot of my poetry that's in different locales are all outtakes from my travel writing, the business travel writing.
Makes sense.
Straight travel, which is not glamorous, mm-hmm. but depends on what you take from it.
Right. I kind of figured that one is definitely going to bleed into the other, and it seems like, that's really the case.
And what happens in the poetry mm-hmm. is that a lot of my poetry, I'd say the majority of it, never uses I. Mm-hmm. I'm always like a spectator.
Right.
I'm always like witnessing, but I'm not essentially in it. I mean, I am, but I'm not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's part of journalism where you have that funny little distance. Sometimes that serves you well in a poem. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it means that you haven't gone far enough with the poem. Whereas my sister she did journalism for a while, but not as long as I did. And her poems really go way past that. And it's like you can really see the depth mm-hmm. Because she has the freedom and the knowledge about how to get into that much more than I do. I hold back a little bit.
Well,
We're different.
Right, exactly.
And my husband's work is very much based on witness. Mm-hmm. He worked in Bronx Psychiatric State as an orderly for a long time, as an aide, and he worked. Mm-hmm. He went to a military college, so that's another book. He did drugs in El Barrio. That's another book. He got out of drugs, and that's another book. That's Logos. So,
right.
So his is much more, it's more gritty. It's more street. He uses a lot of like street jargon mm-hmm. and, like almost dialect, right? And it's really peppered with all that kind of color. So it's witnessing in different ways and different degrees,
Right. Yeah. Everybody brings to the table their experience, and that's what it's all about. Well, Maria, I wanted to thank you so much for doing this and taking the time to share your creative journey with us, and wish you much continued success with all your projects. But before we let you go, you said you were going to do a reading for us, right? What are the titles of the poems you're going to read? And could you tell us a little bit about them before you do it?
You know what? Would you like the one with the guide?
You brought it up. Yeah, I think that would be great.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, that one, because it really expresses how you kind of glean something. Okay, so this one is called Mad with Fear. It's in Thebes.
Okay.
She stands alone atop a bleached white fortress overlooking the turquoise Adriatic. The dry Bura wind brushes the heat of spring sun over her skin. A wind only nature could invent and usually saves for winter. Franica moved to Dubrovnik's old city, protected by tall, thick limestone walls. Not for a moment did we think they would bomb the old town. Not Napoleon, not even Hitler did such a thing. Even when the bombs fell in their shelling hours, we slept, sometimes for 16 hours a day. I have never slept so many hours, so much of my life just spent sleeping. Sometimes when we woke, we could not hear. We could not speak. Her pale, wide-spaced eyes sag at the outer corners, and I wonder if they looked that way before the war, before the shelling, before the long sleeps, before sharing 5 liters of water each day among so many who needed to drink or bathe. At night, we tied our wrists one to another so we could not be lost. Her head lifts, her eyes lock on mine for the first time. And we laughed for no reason, mad with fear.
Wow, that's great.
Amazing, right?
That's great. I love it. I like the uncomfortable laughter, the nervous laughter. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So this one is a little bit crazy. This is a poem. It's about grief. I don't think it's been published anywhere yet.
All right, a first. Okay.
Okay, let's see. Yeah, but it's not a tearjerker or anything. Here we go. So it has a little note on the top. Nota bene. Back in the garage, I cannot keep my hands off another box, another find, another set of poems. This batch is from 1998. A trip to Rome, Naples, Basilicata, zoos, restaurants, Lanciano, past fascists, pheasants, gorillas and rats, cats and snails, and amorous piss-sipping goats. My husband wrote down everything he saw. Not like me, but I wish I was like him. Me? I don't write it all down because I worry. Where am I going to put it? But he never worried about where to put it. He just wrote it. He saw it. He wrote it on the spot, just like that. My husband never worried about where he was going to put it. Not a minute did he worry about where he was going to put it. Me? I'm crazy like that. Where am I going to put this word, this observation? But no, my brilliant, crazy husband never thought about where he was going to put it. It didn't have to fit neatly into a box or on a line or in a folder. No. He never worried about where he was going to put it. He just wrote everything down. And now I have the images so clear as if we were there on Sunday. And I thank my brilliant, crazy husband for never worrying about where he was going to put it.
That's great. It's great.
That kind of explains his way of working.
Yeah,
too.
I was going to say it kind of touches on his way of working, and it also shows the sort of difference between you guys, both great creative talents. And again, I wish you much continued success, and thank you again so much for doing this, and be well.
Thanks very much for having me.
Huge thanks to Maria Lisella for visiting Queens Creative and taking the time out to chat with us. To learn more about Maria and her work, visit poets.org/poet/Maria-Lisella. That's Lisella. Additionally, Ms. Lisella can also be found at marialisella.contently.com. Well, that's a wrap on this episode of QC. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your pods, and please visit Queens Public Television on the web at qptv.org. QPTV can also be found on Facebook at facebook.com/Queens Public Television, and on Twitter and Instagram, we're at QPTV. The executive producer of Queens Creative is Daniel J. Leone. Queens Creative was produced, written, recorded, and mixed by yours truly. Thanks for listening. I'm Mark Bassino. Until next time, cheers, folks.